Hi everyone, welcome to another video, and today we're going to be discussing gaming on Linux. I wanted to create this video in order to help a lot of the folks out with gaming on Linux because I noticed that many people are struggling to get gaming to work in Linux properly. And this is mainly because I think a lot of folks are coming from a Windows world where gaming on Windows has been quite significantly simplified to a point where you pretty much just either install a game through Steam and launch it, or if the game is not in Steam, you just download the executable, you double click the executable, you run through the prompts, you install the game, and then you're able to simply just launch the game. And a lot of folks who are coming from the Windows world are kind of expecting a similar experience in Linux. And I think that when they try to play games that are potentially not even from Steam, because Steam really simplifies their process for Linux significantly through Proton. But I think oftentimes users who are coming from Windows are trying to play games that are outside of their Steam library, and they're having issues, right? And they're not able to install the games properly, or they're missing certain packages. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of show you a way in which you can install all the necessary gaming packages that you would need in order to get gaming to properly work on Linux, and not just in Steam, but also through other clients like Lutris. So let's begin by identifying the current GPU that we have in place. So ultimately, if you have a computer with a gaming GPU, or I should say just a GPU for your games, you're going to have either an AMD or an NVIDIA GPU. And for the most part, I've had both, and I've gamed using both AMD and NVIDIA, and I didn't really have any issues whatsoever. However, with the NVIDIA GPU, since the drivers are proprietary, we're going to have to install those drivers ourselves manually through the package manager. Now, if you already have, or if you haven't installed Linux yet, chances are you're in luck, simply because for the most part, a lot of the different distributions that are out there are going to give you the option of installing Linux with NVIDIA proprietary drivers, which you should, for the most part, always pick if you have an NVIDIA GPU, just because it'll simplify the process of getting the drivers installed. However, if that's not the case and you never installed NVIDIA drivers on your machine that has an NVIDIA GPU, it doesn't really matter either, because you can always install those graphic drivers at a later point through the package manager. It's just that it will be an additional step for you to do after installing Linux. However, if you are using an AMD GPU, chances are you're going to be able to easily install your operating system with the open source AMD drivers, because yes, the AMD drivers are open source, unlike the NVIDIA drivers. And for the most part, there's really nothing for you to do other than just install Linux and make sure that you have the latest packages. At that point, once you've figured out that you have all the proper drivers for both your NVIDIA and your AMD GPU, we can pretty much move to the next section, which is going to be around installing all the necessary game clients in order to get all the gaming to work properly. So first, I'd like to start with installing VIII. So what is VIII, right? So VIII essentially is a compatibility layer. And what it does essentially is it translates the Windows API calls into POSIX calls on the fly, as you can see by the descriptions. This is not an actual virtual machine or any type of emulation. This is literally just translating API calls from Windows to Linux so that you can properly or provide some type of compatibility for the games that only run in Windows. So you're going to find that some of the games that are playable on Linux today are not necessarily in Steam necessarily. They might be outside of Steam. And so what you're going to find often is that you might have to install VIII in order to get this to properly work. And in order for us to be able to install VIII, it is actually quite simple. So all we really got to do is we just have to, looks like I don't have my terminal here. We just have to basically run a simple command that is going to be called sudo pacman-r s, and it's going to be VIII staging. And the reason why I'm going with VIII staging over going with the regular VIII install is because with VIII staging, you'll get the latest updates. And typically for for gaming, you're going to want to have the latest updates, because typically the updates are going to provide, performance boost for your games. They're going to optimize, not necessarily optimize the game, but it's going to be provide a better compatibility and so forth. So what you want to do is you want to make sure you have the latest kind of updates when it comes to gaming. So what we're going to do here is going to hit enter. We're going to provide our password. And what it's going to do is going to install Wine. Now, I already have it installed, but it's just going to reinstall it anyways. And so we're just going to hit enter. It's going to reinstall the Wine staging, but this is basically what it'll be if you were to install, let's say, something like, Wine staging from the beginning. You would basically see the exact same prompts with the exact same information. Next, what I like to do is I like to install Steam, because Steam is going to be basically one of the main gaming clients that most folks are going to install, simply because Valve put in a lot of effort in getting Steam support in Linux, and not just installing the Steam client, but also leveraging something like the Proton, which is similar to Wine. I believe it's actually kind of like Wine, similar to, I think it's a fork of Wine or vice versa, where essentially it does the same thing, right? It translates the API calls, from Windows to Linux, so that Linux can pretty much, run the game and have compatibility, I should say, with the game. So the way to install Steam, it's actually in a very similar fashion to installing Wine. It is a simple command that, allows us to install Steam. So in this case, it will be sudo pacman-s Steam, right? So we're going to hit enter. And what's going to end up happening is when we first install Steam, it's going to ask us to choose between a couple of options for the Vulkan driver, right? And now, if we have an AMD card, the option that we want to go with is 4, right? So the Vulkan Radeon card. However, if we have the NVIDIA card, what we're going to want to do is we want to go with option 2, like this. So in my particular case, I'm going to be using option 4 because I have an NVIDIA GPU. Now, you will be asked a second, or you'll get a second prompt asking you very similar information for the 32-bit library for the Vulkan driver. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to choose the exact same thing we did with option 1, where we went with the option 4. Now, if you're going to be with the NVIDIA driver or the NVIDIA GPU, you're going to be with option 2. So in this case, because I have an AMD GPU, I'm going to go with option 4. And now what this is going to do is it's going to install all the proprietary drivers, or I should say multiple proprietary packages for Steam in order for Steam to properly work with my AMD GPU. Now, at this point, we've successfully installed Steam and we've successfully installed Wine. Now, for the most part, just these two alone is pretty significant when it comes to getting gaming to work on Linux. But we're still missing another client that I personally like to use a lot for games like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy, and that is the Lutris game client. And Lutris is going to allow us to install our games through a script that will pretty much automate the whole process for us without us having to do anything other than just clicking on a link on a website in order to get the game installed, which I will show you temporarily, or I should say, which I will show you shortly. So in order to get the Lutris client installed, it's going to be the same thing that we did for Steam and Wine, which is going to use Lutris as our package name. And so it's going to be sudo pacman-s Lutris. We're going to hit enter. It's going to ask us to install a bunch of packages. We're going to hit enter again because yes is the default. And now what ended up happening was we installed both, or I should say we installed Steam, Lutris, and Wine. Now these 3 packages alone are quite significant, as I mentioned earlier, to get gaming working in Linux. So now what we're going to do is the next steps is going to be to basically set up these gaming clients in order to be able to play games. So now that everything has been installed, let's start with getting Steam up and running and making sure that we can play games on Steam successfully after all the packages have been installed. So the first thing they want to do is obviously launch Steam, right? And when we launch Steam, I should have it right here. When we launch Steam, what's going to end up happening is going to ask you to log in. So you're going to have to log in into your account. Once we log in into Steam, the first thing that we need to do is we need to go to Steam option at the top left, click on settings. Then within the settings menu, what you want to do is you want to go all the way down to Steam Play. And you want to make sure that you enable this option here that is called Enable Steam Play for supported titles, as well as Enable Steam Play for all other titles. Now, what this is going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to download and install games from Steam on Linux. So if you look at one of these games here, you can see I can click on the install button. If I go one of these other games here, I can click on the install button. I can pretty much install any game that is in my library. And this option will typically not be available if you do not have these settings enabled. So oftentimes I see users on forums saying, hey, I cannot get my Steam games working simply because I cannot, the option to install is not available to me. And the reason for this is because they're pretty much missing these two options in Steam. So once you enable these two options, you're going to have to reboot Steam. And then when you go back into Steam or log back into Steam, you're then going to be able to see these install buttons, right? So that you can actually install your games. Now, once Steam is installed and you're able to log in, the next thing that I like to do is I like to get one or two versions of a custom ProtonGE, which is a custom Proton version maintained by the community. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and download custom ProtonGE because from my experience, it provided the best, the best performance in games. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go to this GitHub repo called ProtonGE Custom. So you can actually Google this and you'll bring you to this repo right here. And so the way to install ProtonGE is actually quite simple. So if we look at the installation instructions, all we really have to do is we have to create a directory called compatibility utility tools.d directory if it does not already exist. And then what we're going to do is once we download the ProtonGE package, we'll then have to extract it into this particular directory. We can then restart Steam, and once we restart Steam, we'll then be able to choose the custom ProtonGE version within our game. So I can kind of show it to you here. So if I go to, let's say, Wilson, and I go to Properties, and I go to Compatibility Layer, I can actually force a specific version of Proton. As you can see here, I've already tried Proton 7 before, but we can actually choose different versions of Proton in order to play our games. And what's going to end up happening is sometimes a specific version of Proton is going to be better for some games versus another. So sometimes you're going to end up having multiple versions of Proton. So in order to download the Proton packages, we just have to go to the releases page. You can also find this page all the way at the top here if you click on releases. And typically what you can do is you can pick and choose whatever version of Proton to use. Now here's a trick that I want to show you real quick in terms of helping you decide which Proton version to use. If you go to ProtonDB, oops, wrong spot. If we go to, if we go to ProtonDB website, this website here is basically going to tell you all the games that are being successfully running with Proton versus games that do not work. So, for example, if you wanted to see which game works well with Proton, you can type the name of the game here. So let's say Wilson. So Wilson is here. You can see the classification is gold, runs perfectly after some tweaks. So if we click on Wilson, we can then see the different users who've tried the game and some of the challenges they were having or some of the settings that they were applying in order to get the games to properly work. So in this particular case, the user was having some flickering issues due to post-processing effects, and they ended up fixing that issue by leveraging these commands. So what you can do essentially is you can essentially run these games or install these games using the versions of Proton that these users here have mentioned that they're using. So in this case, they said that this works with Proton 5-0-10, but the faces artifacts with 5.13, 6.13, and so forth, right? So you can pick and choose the right version of Proton to use in order to essentially, improve the performance of the games in Linux. So what I normally do is I reference this website in order to know, what is the best version of Proton to use. So for the sake of our example, if I wanted to, let's say, download, let's say this version here. Let me see which version of Proton I already had here. If I go to Steam, library, and I go to properties, version 7, right? GE1. Now, let's go to our terminal for a second, and let's go to that Steam folder where the Proton's supposed to be installed. Actually, let's do this through the Explorer here, through Nautilus. I mentioned Explorer because I'm used to Windows, but let's do this through Nautilus. Now, in Nautilus, what we can do is we can go to our Steam folder, and we're going to go into Steam, and then we're going to have this compatibilities D folder, and then we're going to have this Proton version here. So what's going to end up happening is when I download my Steam, or I should say when I download the Proton, it should be in this particular directory. So let's go back here to make it easier on the eyes. The actual path of the directory is going to be Steam/, so we're going to list, right? And we're going to go to this folder right here. So we're going to do cd compatibility D. Oops. And then if we list, what we have here is we have this particular ProtonGE version. And if we look at the path, we can see that the path is going to be here, right? So it's going to be the compatibility tools ID. In other words, the only difference for you probably is going to be that you're going to have a different username, but your Steam and your Steam, .steam folder with a Steam and compatibility. So this one exists for you. You're going to have to create this manually. But once you create it, you can then copy your ProtonGE version into this particular location. And then when you go back into Steam, you'll be able to see it. So let's do that real quick. Now, you're going to want to make sure you're downloading the tar file, not these ones, not the source code, but the actual tar file. You can download it into your downloads location. So let's save it. Now that it's downloaded, let's see it in folder. Okay, so now that it's downloaded, let's go ahead and extract it, right? So open with extract. Let's extract this into the path that we just discussed earlier. So it's going to be Steam. We're going to go to Steam. We're going to go to compatibility, and we're going to extract it here. So let's do that. Now, if we're going to look at show files, let's just go take a look real quick on the. So let's go take a look real quick in the home directory. And we're going to go into the Steam folder. Click on Steam again. Compatibility tools D. Now you can see that I have RC, or release candidate version 3. Now, right now, if I go back to Steam, and I click on Wilson, we're not going to be able to see that version there yet, right? And the reason being is because we actually have to restart the Steam client. So let's go ahead and do that. And launch Steam again. Go back to library. Let's check our game properties, compatibility. And now you see we have RC version 3. So this way I can alternate between different Proton versions when I want to install any of my games. Now, let's do a quick test of a game. So I know that Wilson does work with the flickering, but let's just install it just to kind of test it out. Now, this is going to take a couple of minutes to download and install. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it run in the background. And in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video or fast forward, and then we're going to resume as soon as this is done. So now that Wilson is installed and we have configured Wilson to use the custom ProtonGE version that we just downloaded ourselves, let's launch the game and see what happens. And as you can see, the game has launched. Let's look at the settings real quick. So I set everything to very high. I enabled VSync because I didn't want to have any tearing, but you can take this off. If I If I take this off, I'm going to have a lot more iframes. So let's take it off. Let's just play without these things for now. Let's see what happens. Oh, and by the way, yes, I am playing on 1080p right now. So let's start the game. Currently, I'm getting over 300 FPS in the game menu. Of course, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so now that Wilson is installed, we can actually go around and see what is happening in the game, right? So we can kind of see that the game is running pretty well. There's nothing major. I mean, we're looking at 100 plus FPS from what I can see. The game runs really, really well, right? There's nothing worrisome about this. This is a really good experience on my end. I'm sure you guys can see how smooth the game is, and you're only seeing it at 60 FPS, but for me, it's actually about 100 FPS, and it looks great. You know, the game graphics are very high. You know, looks like it runs pretty well for me. Now, the last part of this video, or the last thing that I want to show you, is playing games with Lutris. Now, if there are some games that you play certain games on, like for example, World of Warcraft, that's not available in Steam, so how do you install it, right? How do you get those games to work? What about games like Final Fantasy Online, for example, Final Fantasy 14 Online, I believe, that are, you know, available in Steam, but what if you want to play it outside of Steam, for example? What you can do in this case is you can actually download the games like World of Warcraft, for example, through Lutris. Now, the way that I do it is I look for things. So first thing you can do actually is just go to your search engine and just type in Lutris World of Warcraft. And what it's going to do is going to bring you to this page where you're going to be able to click this install button to install World of Warcraft. Now, what this is going to do essentially is it's going to install through a script the battle.net client, which you can then log into and then install all of the all of the proprietary, or I shouldn't say proprietary, all of the games that you want to play within the battle.net. And I'm talking about specifically about World of Warcraft because not all games do work in Linux. This is something that's very important to note, is that some games that have the easy anti-cheat don't fully work in Linux, but you can use World of Warcraft, for example, so you can install World of Warcraft within Linux and play it successfully. This has been done for years. So the way to do that is to just click the install button. It's going to ask you to open Lutris, essentially, or open. It says open XDG open, but this is really going to open Lutris. And it's going to tell you, hey, do you want to install the game? You're going to say install. It's going to ask you the path. So by default, I configured my Lutris path. So if you look at my Lutris client, under the preferences, I configured the path. Hold on a sec. The path to be in the data folder /games, because my data folder is actually mounted on another. So I have another hard drive in my system that's 1 terabyte. And that disk is mounted to this data folder that is in my home folder. And then within the data folder, I put all my games. So that way my games don't live on the same disk as the operating system, but I also have a lot more space available for my games when I install them. This is the reason why you see the default defaulting to data games, World of Warcraft, because this is what I specified in my preferences. This is the same thing that I recommend you guys do if you do have an additional hard drive as well. So in order to install the game, we just click on the install button. We're going to say continue. And what it's going to do is going to launch Wine. So remember how we installed Wine earlier? Well, guess what? It's going to use Wine to get everything configured and set up and running here as it's supposed to. Now you can see that it's going to launch the battle.net client. So that's a good sign that it's actually installing the client. That's the first thing we need to get the World of Warcraft to work. Now at some point the battle.net client is going to launch like this. You're going to want to click continue to install it. Don't worry if it mentions the C program files. That's not actually within, it is within Linux, but it's under a different path, which you can kind of see actually here when we pick to install it in data games. We can see World of Warcraft, and you can kind of see your drive C, right? So this is where it's going to install your actual game. This is where the drive C comes from. Because remember, we're trying to get a Windows game that works in Windows running in Linux through the use of Wine. Now, the other thing that's going to happen during this installation process is that the Blizzard client is going to launch for the first time and ask you to log in like this. What they tell you here is they say, do not try to log into Battle.net, just close the Battle.net login window when appearing. So let's close it. Right, so that it finished the installation process. And that's it. The Lutris game client has installed the Battle.net client. So what we can do now is we can just validate some of the configuration settings for it. So what I do is I typically click on Configure. We go to System, and we're going to double check and make sure that the game is located in Games, as well as the I like to use an FPS counter. I use Mango HUD, which I can talk about at another point. But I like to enable Mango HUD using for Vulkan. Save that. And then also one last configuration setting I wanted to show you was the runner option. So here you have the Lutris FS stack. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to the staging option. Save. And now let's see what happens when I launch this game. So as you can see, it's launching Wine first. So Wine is again what we installed earlier. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and log in. And now what you see is you basically see the Battle.net client that launched. World of Warcraft is not yet installed. We can locate the game or we can close and install it ourselves. So what we're going to do is we're basically just going to go to games that we already have available to us. And we're going to install this game in order to play. Okay, so we're going to click on install. And this is going to install our game. So I'm going to skip this part, or I'm going to actually pause right now, let it download, and then we're going to come back and try the game. So now that the game has downloaded, let's go ahead and launch the game and see how well it works. So there we go. Let's enter the world. And as you can see, we're in the game. The game runs really well. We're talking about 100 FPS. For settings, I have it set to Ultra. Everything is set to 10. So as you can see, no issues. Everything works well. I have no problems. High frame rates. So yeah, this is it. So this is basically how you get gaming to work in Linux. I mean, this is a pretty long series, or a pretty long video, I should say. But honestly, it doesn't take a lot of time to get all this stuff up and running, and it's pretty straightforward with nothing major to configure. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more of these videos, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to create some more. And at the same time, feel free to subscribe and like the video if this video did help you out in any way possible. Thank you. Have a good day.